All right. So hi everyone. I'm really excited to introduce to you all today, or I guess tonight, for our fireside chat, Dileep Monie, who is a teaching fellow at the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences and is also an MD PhD candidate at the Mayo Clinic Medical Scientist Training Program in Rochester, Minnesota. He earned his bachelor's from Harvard in 2015, where he served as biomedical engineering TF on campus for Dr. Sujata Bhatia. Over the past 7 years, he has lectured for 21 Harvard courses, including 13 virtual courses through the Division of Continuing Education. This year, he is remotely serving as the head TF for biomedical product development, tissue engineering for clinical applications, and biochemical engineering in synthetic life. Given his experience with distance pedagogy, in March 2020, the Associate Dean for Academic Administration appointed him to be a mentor for other Harvard faculty transitioning to the online classroom. And of course, at the Mayo Clinic School of Medicine, Dileep is the head teaching assistant for the surgical skills and regenerative medicine courses. He sees neuro-oncology patients regularly and conducts research in viral and cancer immunology. In response to the pandemic, he is now applying his clinical and scientific expertise to address the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Thank you, Dileep, for joining us tonight. For all of you who don't know me yet, I'm Kiwi. I host our speaker series here at the Harvard SvP Chapter. So let's welcome Dileep to our virtual speaker series.
Thank you so much for having me, Kiwi. It's a real honor, especially given the quality of people you've had on before me.
Well, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. Now, I just want to ask you, like, what are you up to? You're up to so many things, obviously, teaching virtually, in med school and at Harvard long distance. So what are you doing right now in the lab or, at the hospital?
Yeah. So my primary focus day to day is doing research. I'm working on the PhD aspect of my MD PhD. My project is mostly focused on oncolytic viral immunotherapies. So essentially engineering viruses to target cancer cells. And in particular, I'm interested in glioblastoma, or a particularly aggressive brain tumor. And now I also have kind of been using some of that to start a SARS-CoV-2 project with them, which I'm happy to talk a little bit about. And I'm teaching surgical skills right now to the first-year medical students at Mayo, the biomedical product development course remotely at the Harvard Extension School. And that's really the bulk of it. Clinically, I work with a neurosurgeon here, so I either see patients at clinic or in the ORs at least one day a month as part of my clinical training here.
That sounds amazing. Can you talk more about, you've been teaching virtual classes online for many years now. What do you think has changed since the pandemic, since this lockdown, and, or what stayed the same for you, essentially?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I left Cambridge in 2016 to come to Mayo Clinic in Rochester here. And with that, I transitioned I was luckily able to stay on as a teaching fellow, thanks to Dr. Bhatia. And with that, I have been teaching remotely since then. And we actually made my transition back then. So with the pandemic pushing everything to remote courses, what's really changed for me, not so much how we teach, but the demand for our classes has really gone up. So before, when we made the decision to switch from doing the class in person to doing it online, there's less of a demand for it. I mean, people, if they're in the Cambridge area, they love to be on the Harvard campus and come to the classroom. We had a great space in Pierce Hall where we did most of our teaching. It was a really popular class then. As soon as we moved off campus, fewer people would come. Now that the pandemic's hit and everything has moved online, we're seeing a huge surge in people that are signing up for our classes, simply because I think it allows the students to follow their interest rather than make the debate, well, am I getting sort of a second class education by doing this online?
Yeah, let's talk more a little about that, because I think, like, there used to be a stigma about like online learning, like online universities, right? As some people would call it. But now it seems like, this is the standard. Do you think this will become the standard post COVID?
I mean, I think it'll become more prevalent. I mean, I think there'll always be a place for in-person learning. Certainly things like the surgical skills that I teach at Mayo requires quite a bit of close observation of how people move their hands and give them personalized feedback that way. So it's something that could probably be done with more advanced cameras in people's homes and things like that. But we're, by our human nature, we still engage more. Or mentally, being in the same room as someone, it's easier to pay attention to them. Just seeing them on a video camera, our brains are not wired to deal with this type of input quite the same way. So you pay a little bit less attention, it's harder to retain it. So I see that being one aspect. But the bigger thing is, I think that this is part of a bigger trend that was in place before COVID, was moving things online. And I think particularly in the United States, but worldwide, the cost of higher education has been skyrocketing. It's outpacing inflation, and it's not sustainable. And one way to really lower the cost of that is to reduce the number of teaching faculty and out there. And one way you could do that is by having them deliver content online that's consumable by a large number of people. So we've seen that with things like Khan Academy, people putting stuff up on YouTube. Harvard got into the game. They've been in the game for a long time with Division of Continuing Education, which is the extension school and the summer school. But they really stepped it up, I think, in 2012 with the edX effort with MIT and their Harvard X program, where they started putting really high quality content online for free. And even the Harvard College classes and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences classes will sometimes use that as their sort of core teaching, and then allow the faculty to come in and use a flipped classroom model, where they would otherwise be lecturing to the student. Now they spend the classroom time really engaging the student in sort of a dialogue. So I think that trend it's been really accelerated by this pandemic. It's probably here to stay, where no matter if you're taking a class in person or if you're doing it all remotely, it's most of your classes are going to have a huge online component from here on out.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think now we're touching upon, like the question of like, what do you think, or how do you think this pandemic has impacted the trajectory of higher education in general? Can you expound more on, I guess, just one bit? Do you think that the quality of higher education is now impacted in any way at all, do you think? I mean, obviously it's just like this video interface, right? Rather than just the in-person interface. But for some, for some specializations, like in higher education, this format does in fact work for the long run, right?
Yeah. So it's obviously, it's clearly impacted the quality of education, just because people are not used to this transition to being online. And there's certain things that are very difficult to teach online, or we just haven't figured out the best way to teach that material online. And the resources, the infrastructure isn't fully there. Mayo uses Blackboard as one platform, but Zoom has become increasingly popular for different features. And it's not clear on what's the best delivery mechanism, how best to set these up. And we're still learning about it. On the flip side, I think what is education? Education is a large part is how to learn too. So by forcing students into this sort of uncomfortable position where they may not be learning the core material, the traditional subjects maybe quite as well, they're learning how to learn in this new manner, which is tremendously valuable, because, like as I mentioned, in order for higher education to be sustainable in the future, a lot of the work will have to be done online and done remotely. And if students, particularly younger students, now can figure out how they can learn using this new infrastructure, I think that will serve them tremendously well in the future.
I agree, definitely. So I guess, which brings me to my next question. For higher education, especially, for graduate students doing their PhDs or their MDs, just like yourself and myself, and other people on this call, how do you think their training should be handled moving forward? Do you think universities should fully adapt a system, or at least have a system in place already, given the uptick of cases in COVID? Like, do you think, this is like we can move forward with also PhD and MD trainings through this platform right now?
Yeah, so PhD and MD training, I've come to realize they have a lot of parallels, but they also have a lot of unique quirks to them. And I think, me speak on the MD part first. There's a lot of rote memorization in it, and in fact, the first 2 years of medical school, most medical schools is all preclinical. There are some clinical experiences, but the core focus is really memorizing a huge amount of information, and gain some of that context. And the teachers do a great job of giving some clinical context, but most of the work is actually done outside the classroom when students are diving into resources like first aid, or they're building Anki decks for spaced repetition, just to memorize things, or using resources like Boards and Beyond, or question banks like UWorld. These things sort of form the core of the medical student experience, and they can be done entirely without going to class. So many medical schools will see very few people actually show up into the classroom, so that they're already getting there. They're choosing to learn this stuff online because it results in higher board scores for them in the end. At the end of second year, you're taking your USMLE medical licensing exam. So that particularly seems to work well. What you miss out on is the patient interaction and patient experience. But much like the issues with higher education, the cost of higher education, the cost of healthcare is also outpaced inflation. And another solution to that has been virtual visits with physicians. For example, my insurance company gives me an app that they try to encourage me to use that app to consult a physician before I make an appointment with my primary care doctor. So I think the future of medicine, how it's practiced too, a lot of it will be online. So it's useful that even if the medical students are not able to get their direct patient experience, they need to be able to know how to take a history virtually. They need to be able to do as much of like the quote physical exam, at least a physical observation over video, so that they can assess patients sufficiently whether or not they need to come in to the office or to be referred elsewhere. So that's a valuable part of the training that I think is going to stick with us. And it's a trend that was in place before the pandemic. The pandemic has really just accelerated that. On the PhD side, as you probably know well, it's a lot more deep thinking. It's a lot more creativity. It's a lot more about grit and perseverance through failure upon failure, and then just getting through it and making it making some unique contribution to your field. And to do that, I think we've been in the biomedical side. We've historically been in the lab doing PCR and cell culture and Western blots. The more recently, a lot of these techniques are become more high throughput. They're spitting out more and more data. So we're actually in a good position where we don't need to be in the lab as much anymore as we used to. We can design experiments offsite. We can go in and do them, or even contract out with core labs to do them, and then get the data and spend most of our time really thinking deeply about what does the data mean? How do we analyze it? How do we how do we sort of create new models of the biological world with that data. And I think that is something that's been accelerated against. We were kind of forced to adopt that future a little bit faster with the pandemic, but that trend was already in place. So I think there's going to be an uptick in the interest in computational and systems biology in particular. There's already a huge amount of buzz around AI, artificial intelligence, throughout every field, but increasingly so in medicine and in the biomedical sciences, being able to use that. And it's really just statistics on steroids that you're trying to make these inferences from your large data set. So it's it's all buzzwordy and all. It's nothing more than what we were doing, calculating p-values 50 years ago, but we're just doing it on a much larger scale and trying to understand how the world works. And I think that core essence of what we're doing remains the same throughout this.
Absolutely. So I think for those in our audience interested in applying to grad school in the near future, in the next couple of years, how do you recommend prospective students navigate through this process during the pandemic? We're still unsure when this might end, right? Given that most in-person internships are basically canceled until further notice, what would you recommend? Now, I understand you also serve, as like one of the admissions committee, like as students, like in your MD PhD program, in evaluating, the applicants. What would you recommend? What are some tips that students today should take note of?
Yeah, so again, with the MD PhD is this weird hybrid of two worlds that I think work well together, but the training is very different, and I think also the preparation and the evaluation of students is a bit different. So MD PhD applications are more aligned with, I think, the traditional medical school application, because they submit the AMCAS application typically and take the MCAT, and they usually submit a few extra essays. Some programs require the GRE as well, but very, very few now, especially even now that most PhD programs require the GRE. So from the MD or MD PhD side of things, you still need good grades in your undergraduate courses. So you just have to adapt to however your undergraduate program is responding to the pandemic. So if you're doing well in class before, you have to be able to do well remotely. And again, that's just a good it's a good metric of a physician or physician scientist, because you need to be able to respond to a changing environment. You can't be relying necessarily on things staying the same for you. The MCAT scores will always probably be a factor, for better or for worse. But the other intangibles, this sort of idea of leadership. So leading an organization like Students versus Pandemics is one of those things that show up on a application and is looked upon favorably. And now people can lead these student groups remotely. So they're just being able to adapt to that is fairly normal. Getting clinical experience has sort of been a big sticking point. A lot of clinics have scaled down operations, but at the same time, they're really kicking out, pre-medical students, because they're an easy way to reduce the number of people in the clinic. So encourage social distancing, keep your patients safe, keep your staff safe. So to respond to that, I think there's a whole other huge unmet need of patients that come up. So it could be like staffing COVID screening stations in your hometown, or they're looking for volunteers, and that gives you some clinical experience. You're talking to somebody probably with a mask on that may have a cough, and you're taking their temperature and doing a swab or something like that. So that's one way to get it. And we really try to encourage people to get creative in this time. Again, it's a great way to show off how creative you're being about getting that clinical experience. And it may be figuring out there's still need in the community, like homeless shelters, for example, still need people to help out and care for them, but they're operating in different capacities. And how can you kind of get involved as a potential applicant, and just really just because you're generally interested in helping out people during this time. On the PhD side, the GREs have kind of gone away. Grades are a little bit less important, just simply because we're really looking for creativity on this part, not so much can you memorize a phone book capability. So that becomes it. And so just basically, but still looking for leadership on the PhD side. The research side, again, the computational and systems biology aspects of things, there are tons of public data sets out there. You can engage with labs that are more computational now and try to learn those methods. And those are actually becoming in really hot demand because the pandemic has really accelerated the trend toward that. Labs that have operated more traditionally up until the pandemic are really seeking out graduate students that have that capability. It's like, well, we can't have everybody in the lab now all the time. So how do we do that? How do we get that expertise in it? Low hanging fruit would be get a new graduate student who knows how to do the computational stuff and have them join the group.
Yeah, I guess those are very good tips. Thank you so much for that. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the huge elephant in the room, that is Zoom fatigue. We all suffer from it, both you and I, and I'm sure a lot of the people in this call suffer from it as well. So actually, the questions we received mostly before your talk was, how do you keep energized, during a Zoom call, outside, off Zoom as well, and like, what have you found yourself to be helpful?
Yeah, so I think like anything, paying attention to like your mental health is the most important part. And I think that really starts fundamentally with diet and exercise and sleep. Those are probably the three pillars. Hydration is part of your diet too. So making sure that, because even though your schedule is disrupted, your sort of sense of normalcy is disrupted, those pillars still remain the same. You can't. It's easy to sitting at home. I find it's very difficult to socially distance from the fridge, and you need to be able to do that. Stick to a regular diet. Keep what you were doing before. Exercise may be a little bit more challenging, especially with the winter months in a place like Cambridge or here in Minnesota, especially when gyms are shut down. But finding YouTube videos of home workouts, body weight workouts, buying maybe small equipment, jump ropes or push-up stands or yoga mats from online, and then using them at home rather than going to the gym might be some good options. But just whatever you do, you need to take care of that. Make sure you're also getting enough sleep, because again, being at home all day, it's very hard to call it quits. Like when you leave the lab, historically, that's when you do some work at home, but that's like your boundary. Here at home, it's like, well, it's 1 a.m. I could work some more. Really set time that you're going to stop working. You're going to focus on yourself to eat or to sleep. That schedule is also really important in terms of your Zoom meetings. So because Zoom meetings are like they're global. Like right now, anyone in the world could join in on this, right? And actually, I'm glad it's actually kind of a small group, because it would be very silly if everybody that could join in on it does join in on it right now, because they would be taken away from their downtime, their ability to eat a normal meal or something like that. So I think it's very important that you become increasingly selective of what you go to, right? Yeah. When you're on campus, you're very limited on what you can go to, because it's like, okay, this is campus. The events that are on campus are my domain. I'm not gonna, if something's going on at MIT, it's great. If something's going on at Boston University, that's great, but I'm not going to hop on the red line and do that. Like, this is my domain. So, but now you've got everything in the world. So be very selective on what Zoom calls you want to hop in on, and be, particularly pick the ones that you intend to participate in. maybe so. I mean, I think perfect example is, I think last time with Dr. Bly's talk, I made a faux pas in that I was trying to do 2 Zoom calls at once. I jumped in on it, realized very quickly that this was a bad idea, and I hopped off on it. But I did watch his talk on YouTube afterwards, and really glad I did. And I think that gets me to my next point, would be that watch recordings if possible. So like this talk is obviously recorded. Watch it. If you're not going to necessarily engage in the dialogue, which is probably true for most of your Zoom calls, see if you can get a recording of it and watch it, on 2x speed maybe, because when you're talking to somebody, talking at this rate makes sense, but when you're just listening to somebody like lecture you, I'm probably talking way too slow for you on that. So speed it up, and that way your mind is focused. You're like, I got to listen to every word. You do it in half the time, and boom, all of a sudden you have more time to eat, more time to sleep, more time to exercise, and you stay in control of the situation. I think that's really the take-home points for that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's one of the biggest advantages, to now this online learning, where lectures are recorded, at least for my graduate courses. You have the opportunity to just, fast forward, pause, and maybe if you didn't hear it again, like you can go back. So I think I must say I love that feature. And I'm sure the rest of the students appreciate that too. So I think we have a couple of questions from the audience here that's been privately emailed. One of them, and you may not have the answer to this, so that's okay, but we just maybe want to get your opinion on like the cost of university to provide online education. And, since it's cheaper, do you think tuition should be lowered?
So I think in the long term, it's cheaper. I think right now we're in a situation where there has to be a huge investment in the infrastructure and moving all this stuff online. So I think for universities, it's actually more expensive right now. In the long run, it's going to be cheaper and averaged out. So the question is like, should the students that are moving online now, should they, pay less somehow, so that because in the future, the university is going to benefit from this investment in the infrastructure. It's tricky. It's a place like Harvard might have the ability to do it with a sufficient endowment to spread that out and realize that we'll take a loss these few years and we will recoup it by having this great infrastructure for years to come. And we can still, it's very hard, to lower the price of something, because people, like, once you lower it, it's hard to move back up, but at least stop the crazy inflation, like raising tuition every year is something that I think will probably happen as a result of this. The question comes to is what happens to the campus too. So a place like, you already have all the buildings and infrastructure there, even if it's not occupied, you still have to pay to maintain them. And so it becomes a little bit tricky in that sense too. The game has changed. So, could there be more, there's probably more advantages for smaller schools that don't already have all that infrastructure in place, that they can sort of take advantage of what larger schools are doing online, adapt like edX courses like from Harvard or from MIT, have that as part of their classes. They don't have a whole lot of on-campus facilities. They just have their professors, kind of talk through the material that's generated by another university. And that I think would be, that's how, most people I envision will probably learn in the future. And that would be probably a much lower cost. But it's hard right now. It's hard when everyone's suffering. I know all of us are struggling with it, just because it's different. But the universities are struggling with it financially too, because this is new for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess another question from the audience would be, do you think that there would now be more opportunity for international collaborations, scientifically between organizations? Do you think that's more easily accessible?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think, we even before this pandemic, if we wanted to, we had the opportunity, Zoom isn't new to the pandemic. It was before, it was there before. There was Skype before, phone calls, obviously. So there were already international collaborations. I think this just sort of encourages it, because I think
Mhm.
um, the sort of downside of an international collaboration was that you couldn't just casually bump into your colleague in the hallway and then just have like, oh, let's chat about this thing that we were discussing about last week, and like, oh, all of a sudden a new idea pops up and you quickly move on, because you aren't doing that with your colleagues in, that are in the same lab as you right now. You aren't seeing them quite as often. So it's that benefit is gone. So that evens the playing field for collaborating with people outside your lab, outside your institution, outside your country.
Yeah. There's another question, which I think is interesting, and I'm sure a lot of people would love to know about, which is, how would you teach people skills to students, given the virtual education today, right? And like, how would you, I guess, what's your opinion on how students should still try to work on their people's skills while not being in a physical workplace? I think that's now more challenging than before. It was already challenging before because, not everyone's an extrovert, not everyone loves, interacting with others in person, right?
Yeah,
So how can we work on that?
this is a really good question. So it gets back to one of those things that was maybe a stigma of online education before, is that maybe you don't work on your people skills that way, but at least you could go out, you go out shopping, you go out to a restaurant, you go hang out with friends, like you do all that sort of stuff, so you can get the socialization outside of your school. So that was never like as big an issue. Right now we can't even do
Hmm.
that. So that it does become a bigger problem, and people are spending more time at home, spending more time in their pajamas. Um, it's even now that I'm teaching the first year med students, it's very different than my first year med school. Excuse me. It's very different than my first year of med school, in the sense that half the time I'd have to be in a suit because a patient would be coming to the classroom, and there's a huge professionalism curriculum in medicine. And now when I go in to see the students, they don't dress up as quite as much, which doesn't really matter. It doesn't bother me too much, but I think like when we're trying to train the physicians to, carry themselves in a manner that patients, see, you come in, you walk in, you're like, okay, I'm at the doctor, I trust their opinion, then that becomes a little bit more of a challenge. So I think, I don't know if I have a really good answer for that one. But I think if when we have students come in for whatever components that they need to come in for, to maybe encourage some time for them to socialize and talk about at least on the medical side of things, that's more of a talking to about your professionalism in terms of how you interact with others. But for the most part, uh, it's going to be a challenge, especially if this has to be a long-term thing,
Yeah,
students that have to go through this for a long period of time, the social norms are going to be different.
absolutely. I agree. And I think, there are platforms out there, which I learned from you, such as Gather, like fun ways instead of just, the regular Zoom, which nowadays people, don't really want to do Zoom and meet, and catching up. They do want an alternative platform, which you mentioned Gather is like also, an alternative there, which is more fun.
Yeah, I'll follow on that. I mean, so that's what some of the residency programs in Mayo and some of the other medical schools have been doing, is they've been using things like GatherTown, which is almost like an 8-bit version of Zelda type interactive environment, where you control an avatar, and then your behaviors and like how you walk up to people and engage them, and how you end the conversation and move on to another conversation. Those types of things then start to come out, because at Zoom, we know when this conversation ends, at the time it ends, that's it. It doesn't really matter how you uh, get off of the call, but and how you get on it. But being able to control an avatar like that, I think, will give you a little bit more of a hint of how people interact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was all of our questions. To leave us, since we're almost running out of time, before you leave us,
Yeah.
can you envision or tell us what post-COVID life might be like?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And in terms of education, medicine, and research, I mean, I think none of it's going to return to the way it was before, even if we completely eradicate COVID. And that's simply because what I mentioned at the beginning, where I see these trends in education and in patient care and in research. They were already there before the pandemic, and the pandemic is really, well, it's been particularly painful because we had to do it so quickly and without the proper infrastructure in place. But um, it was going to happen sooner or later, that we were going to have more and more online experiences in terms of learning, again, to control the cost of providing an education. Also, I think we'll see more of the rise of like a superstar professor. So I think the idea of like David Malin or CS50 at Harvard is probably the big one. They've sort of taken over. He and his group of 100 plus TFs have taken over the freshman computer science course at Yale. I think that we're going to see more of that, and that's going to help us not only get better education, because I mean, he's obviously really dedicated himself to becoming really good at online teaching. So we all benefit from that, but also lowering the cost of it, because that can be disseminated worldwide once you put the upfront investment in generating the content. Same with the with patient care. I think we're gonna see more and more virtual visits, just because it lowers the cost of people coming in. I mean, right now, particularly people that are uninsured, the first thing that they tend to do is they go to the emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's extremely expensive, and it burdens the healthcare system tremendously. So if there's an option to do low cost virtual visits for these people, and say like, very few of them will need to go to the emergency room, but you can tell them go to the emergency room, or you can say, well, just put a Band-Aid on it, or take it some Tylenol and talk to us in the morning or something like that. That will really help lower costs. And I think it's going to stick with us after COVID, because right now people are going to the emergency room less because they're afraid of getting COVID.
Exactly.
It may have shifted too far, where people are sometimes not going to the emergency room when they need to for chest pain and things like that. But I think we're going to find a happy median where virtual visits are going to be part of our future. And then touching on the research part of things, the computational research is really going to pick up sort of the core facility models, which are already in place at universities. Like Harvard has tons of core facilities, Mayo has tons of core facilities. We're just going to rely on them more, and they're going to build out more and more robotics and laboratory automation and lab on a chip type systems to really get us the data that we need. And we're really our jobs as scientists is really going to be to think about the questions, the most salient questions to help humanity, and at the same time churn through that data and really try to understand what does it mean, so that we can develop better therapies or understand the world in a more informative manner.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a lot of things are still uncertain. As we find out more about vaccines and development and treatments for the virus, really. But thank you so much for your time. I think we addressed all the questions that we received, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon in the near future for maybe a round 2 of our speaker series.
All right, I'd love to. This has been been a great experience. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. And for those listening in our future podcast, thanks for listening. See you later.